They were the most terrifying military force the world had ever seen. From the frozen steppes of Mongolia, they swept across the known world like a tide of fire and steel. They shattered the armies of China. They destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and burned Baghdad, the greatest city in the Islamic world, to ashes in 1258. They crushed the armored knights of Poland and Hungary and reached the gates of Vienna. They conquered Russia and subjected it to 2 centuries of domination. They sent fleets of 140,000 men and 3,500 ships against Japan in the largest amphibious operations the medieval world had ever attempted. No army had ever stopped them permanently. No fortress had ever held against them indefinitely. No civilization had successfully defied the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, and walked away entirely free. Almost no civilization. In the late 13th century, Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, the ruler of the Mongol Empire, the emperor of China, the most powerful man on earth, turned his attention to the Philippine Islands. He sent his diplomatic missions. He demanded submission. He extended the reach of the Yuan dynasty's tributary system toward the archipelago at the eastern edge of his maritime ambitions. The Filipinos did not submit, and what followed, the Mongol attempt to bring the Philippines into its imperial orbit, and the extraordinary reasons why it failed, is one of the most remarkable untold stories in all of ancient world history. Not because there was a single great battle, but because the Philippine archipelago itself, its geography, its warriors, its waters, and its ancient maritime civilization was simply unconquerable. A story that almost no Filipino today has ever been taught. A story that colonial history buried not because it was unimportant, but because a people who knew they had defied the Mongols were much harder to colonize than a people who believed their history began with a Spanish ship. Hey history lovers, quick favor before we start. If you enjoy today's video, please help me reach 5,000 likes and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing historical stories. Chapter 1. The World of Kublai Khan. To understand what happened, you first have to understand the empire that came knocking. The Mongol Empire at its height stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, from the Korean peninsula to the borders of Poland. It covered over 24 million square kilometers and encompassed perhaps a third of the world's total population. Built in less than a century, beginning with the unification of the Mongolian tribes under Genghis Khan in 1206, it was a military system of terrifying and unprecedented effectiveness. Cavalry armies of extraordinary mobility, logistical sophistication, psychological warfare that used the reputation of Mongol ferocity to break enemy resistance before battle was joined, and an intelligence network that gathered detailed information about enemy vulnerabilities before any campaign began. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols destroyed every major power they encountered. The Jin dynasty of northern China fell. The Khwarezmian Empire was destroyed in a campaign of such systematic brutality that cities which had flourished for centuries were reduced to fields of bones. Baghdad was sacked in 1258. Contemporary accounts describe rivers running black with the ink of destroyed books and red with the blood of the dead. Between 200,000 and 800,000 people were killed in a single city in a single campaign. By 1260, the eastern portion of the empire, China and Mongolia, was ruled by Kublai Khan, the most culturally sophisticated and most ambitious of Genghis Khan's grandsons. Kublai completed the conquest of China. The great Song dynasty, finally falling in 1279. He established the Yuan dynasty with its capital at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, and inherited the Mongol vision of universal empire. Every kingdom that had not submitted was, by definition, in rebellion against the natural order. He was systematic. Korea was already a vassal. Vietnam was invaded in 1257 and again in 1283 and 1287. Burma faced Mongol military pressure from 1277. Java was targeted for an expedition in 1293. Japan was invaded in 1274 with nearly 900 ships, and again in 1281 with 3,500 ships and 140,000 men. Both expeditions failing, the second devastated by the Great Typhoon the Japanese called kamikaze, the divine wind, which killed over 120,000 Mongol and Chinese soldiers and destroyed the fleet. It was in this context of systematic expansion across all of East and Southeast Asia that the Philippines entered the story. Chapter 2. The Philippine Kingdoms. The Philippines of 1281 was not a single unified state. It was an archipelago of hundreds of independent and semi-independent polities, each with its own ruler, its own territory, its own alliances and rivalries. But several were significant enough, wealthy enough, powerful enough, internationally connected enough to attract the attention of the most powerful empire on earth. On the northern bank of the Pasig River, commanding the trade routes of Manila Bay, sat the kingdom of Tondo. Yuan dynasty Chinese records document regular trade relations between Tondo and the Chinese court. Tondo's rulers sent tribute missions to China, received Chinese merchants, and participated in the tributary relationships that structured China's relations with its Southeast Asian neighbors. Kublai Khan's court had records of Tondo. His merchants traded with it. On the northeastern coast of Mindanao sat the ancient Rajahnate of Butuan, one of the oldest and most internationally connected polities in the archipelago. Butuan's formal contact with China stretched back centuries. As early as 1011 CE, nearly 3 centuries before Mongol pressure reached the Philippines, a Butuan ambassador had presented the Song Emperor with an engraved gold tablet and established formal diplomatic relations. By the late 13th century, Butuan remained a major trading center whose harbor was a crossroads for merchants from China, Java, and Borneo. The Visayas were home to numerous smaller but militarily significant polities. The Pintados warrior culture, those warriors covered in elaborate tattoos recording their combat achievements, meant the Visayan Islands were defended by some of the most formidable fighters in Southeast Asia. People who had been sailing the Philippine Sea for thousands of years, who knew every current and every reef, whose warriors had honed their fighting traditions through generations of inter-barangay warfare and maritime raiding. The Philippine polities of 1281 were not militarily unsophisticated. Pre-colonial Filipino warfare combined open battle, naval combat, raiding, and ambush. Philippine warriors were skilled with the kampilan, the kris, and the spear, particularly lethal in the close-quarters jungle and coastal environments of the archipelago. Their outrigger warships were superbly adapted to Philippine waters, fast, shallow-drafted, extraordinarily maneuverable. In the waters of their own archipelago, Philippine warriors had every advantage that geography could provide. Chapter 3. The Demand and the Defiance. The Mongol approach to expansion was consistent. Before military action against any new territory, the Mongols sent ambassadors demanding submission. The ruler of the target territory was offered a choice: submit voluntarily and be incorporated as a vassal, or refuse and face the consequences. This system worked remarkably often. The reputation of the Mongol Empire was itself the greatest weapon in its diplomatic arsenal. In the late 13th century, Yuan dynasty diplomatic pressure extended into the Philippine archipelago. Chinese records document contacts with Philippine polities during this period, tribute missions, diplomatic exchanges, and the complex negotiations of a small maritime civilization, managing the demands of the most powerful empire in the world. Some Philippine rulers did send tribute to the Yuan court. In the sophisticated diplomatic world of maritime Southeast Asia, sending gifts to a powerful foreign ruler was a normal part of statecraft, a way of maintaining access to Chinese markets, of managing a dangerous relationship. But tribute and submission were not the same thing, and the broader historical record makes the outcome unmistakably clear. The Philippines was never conquered by the Mongols, never incorporated into the Yuan dynasty's tributary system as a genuine vassal, never subjugated the way Korea was, the way Vietnam was ultimately forced into nominal submission after 3 devastating wars. Chinese historical sources reference a polity called Ma'ai, identified by most historians as a Philippine entity, in connection with tensions with the Yuan dynasty during this period. The details are debated and the sources are fragmentary, but the conclusion is not debatable. The Mongols came, and they did not prevail. Chapter 4: 5 Reasons the Mongols Failed. The failure of Mongol expansion to incorporate the Philippine archipelago was not accidental. It was the product of 5 distinct factors that together made the Philippines one of the most unconquerable environments on Earth. The first reason was geography. More than 7,000 islands, divided by channels and straits, covered in dense jungle, ringed by shallow coastal waters, full of reefs, subject to violent tropical weather that could materialize with terrifying speed. The Mongol military system was designed for rapid movement across open terrain, encirclement of enemy forces, and the decisive battle that ended resistance in a single catastrophic engagement. It had no answer for an archipelago. There was no capital to capture, no single army to destroy, no central point whose fall meant total victory. The archipelago itself was the fortress, and it had no gate. The second reason was disease. The tropical diseases of the Philippine Islands were for any army not born to them potentially more deadly than any human enemy. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and the full arsenal of tropical infectious disease waited patiently for any force that arrived without natural immunity. The Mongol soldiers, men from the cold, dry steppe and the temperate plains of China, carried none of the biological defenses that generations of Filipino ancestors had developed through lifetimes of exposure to this environment. Kublai Khan's own campaigns in Vietnam and Burma were severely hampered by exactly this factor. The Mongols acknowledged explicitly that tropical disease and climate undermined their military effectiveness across Southeast Asia. The third reason was Philippine naval superiority in local waters. In the open ocean, larger Chinese-style Mongol vessels might have projected formidable power. But the waters of the Philippine archipelago were not the open ocean. They were a maze of shallow channels, coral reefs, and mangrove-fringed coastlines where deep-drafted vessels were useless or actively dangerous. Philippine outrigger warships could attack and withdraw before heavier ships could respond. They could disappear into shallow coves where the Mongols could not follow. Philippine sailors had been navigating these waters for tens of thousands of years. They knew every reef, every current, every hidden channel. In an archipelago, naval superiority in local waters is everything. The fourth reason was the fighting quality of Philippine warriors. The warriors the Mongols would have encountered were not terrified peasant militias. They were experienced, skilled, motivated fighters trained from childhood in a tradition specifically adapted to the Philippine environment. The Kali martial tradition, ancestor of modern Filipino martial arts, recognized by military professionals worldwide as one of the most effective close-quarters combat systems ever developed, was the product of exactly this culture. In the jungle, in the mangroves, in the coastal ambushes that defined warfare in the Philippine environment, the Filipino warrior was at his most lethal. The fifth reason was the weather. The Philippines sits in the most typhoon-active region on Earth. On average, 20 tropical cyclones enter or form within Philippine waters every year. In the late 13th century, there was no weather forecasting of any kind. The same typhoon season that destroyed Kublai Khan's fleet of 3,500 ships and 140,000 men off the coast of Japan in 1281, the kamikaze that became one of the most famous meteorological events in world history, extended across the same Pacific waters where any Mongol naval expedition toward the Philippines would have had to operate. The Philippine typhoon belt was not a passive barrier. It was an active defender, ancient, impartial, and utterly indifferent to the ambitions of any empire. Chapter 5: The Comparison. To fully appreciate what the Philippine resistance meant, you have to understand what happened to everyone else who faced the same imperial pressure. Vietnam fought off 3 Mongol invasions in 1257, 1283, and 1287, using guerrilla tactics, scorched earth strategy, and brilliant generalship under Tran Hung Jiao, one of the greatest military commanders in Southeast Asian history. Vietnam's resistance was achieved at enormous and devastating cost. Multiple invasions, catastrophic destruction, massive casualties. And at the end of it all, Vietnam still had to accept nominal tributary status to stop the fighting. 3 wars, enormous sacrifice, nominal submission. Japan's repulsion of the 1274 and 1281 invasions is the most famous instance of Mongol failure in history. Both times, massive Mongol fleets were devastated by typhoons, the kamikaze. Japan's samurai warriors fought effectively on the beaches. But it was the storms, rather than Japanese military action alone, that destroyed the invasion force of 1281. The Japanese themselves acknowledged this. The divine wind was heaven's intervention, not human military achievement alone. Java, targeted in 1293, was penetrated by a Mongol force of 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers, who achieved initial military success before being drawn into a local power struggle, ambushed, and forced to withdraw. Java was never fully conquered, but the Mongol force reached its shores, fought on its soil, and left only after significant military engagement. The Philippines stands apart from all of these. Vietnam needed 3 wars and still accepted nominal submission. Japan needed divine typhoons. Java needed a clever ambush after the Mongols had already landed. The Philippines, through its geography, its warriors, its waters, and the unconquerability of an archipelago civilization that had been developing maritime and military capability for tens of thousands of years, never required a single decisive engagement to turn the Mongols back. The archipelago was the defense, the sea was the wall, the jungle was the fortress, and the Filipino people were the garrison that had been defending it since before the Mongol Empire existed. Chapter 6. Why this story was buried. Why don't Filipinos know this story? Why is the Mongol failure to conquer the Philippines absent from school curricula, unknown to most of the public, unmentioned in popular histories? The answer is the same answer that explains the obscurity of the pre-colonial gold civilization, the forgetting of the kingdom of Tondo, the erasure of Baybayin, and the suppression of the Babaylan. The colonial project required a specific story about the Filipino people. Simple, island-bound, without meaningful history, without connections to the great currents of world events. A people who needed civilization brought to them from outside. A history in which Philippine kingdoms successfully resisted the most powerful empire in the history of the world did not fit that narrative, so it was not taught, not incorporated into the historical memory that colonial education preserved and promoted, not made part of the story. Filipino children were taught about who their people were and what their civilization had achieved. When Filipino children were taught history under Spanish rule, their history began with Spain. Everything before, the Mongol contacts, the piloncito economy, the diplomatic missions to Chinese emperors, the Sanskrit civilization of the pre-colonial kingdoms, was erased, not because it was unimportant, because a people who knew their history were harder to colonize than a people who believed they had none. The sources documenting Mongol-Philippine contacts are preserved in Chinese archives, in the records of the Yuan dynasty court, and in Chinese administrative histories. They are in classical Chinese, studied primarily by specialist historians of Mongol expansion and Chinese Southeast Asian relations. They have not been widely translated into Filipino languages. They remain the preserve of specialists, known to the academic community, but invisible to the general public. That is beginning to change. Filipino historians and international scholars of Southeast Asian history are recovering this story, and this video is part of that recovery. Chapter 7. The Identity Anchor. The most powerful empire in the history of the world came to these islands. They came with warships and the accumulated military genius of a dynasty that had never been permanently stopped. They came representing a Khan whose word had ended civilizations, whose armies had burned the greatest cities on earth, whose power extended from the Pacific to the borders of Europe. And the Philippines turned them back. Not with a single great battle, not with a divine typhoon, but with something deeper and more fundamental, with geography, with disease, with the knowledge of their own waters that tens of thousands of years of maritime civilization had produced, with the fighting quality of warriors trained from childhood, with the stubborn, implacable refusal of a people on their own ground to submit to power from across the sea. These were not qualities that appeared in 1281 as a response to the Mongol threat. They were qualities that had been developing for 50,000 years, since the first human beings arrived on these islands and began the long process of learning to survive, to navigate, and to defend a world of more than 7,000 islands in one of the most complex environments on Earth. The same qualities that turned back Mongol pressure would turn back the Spanish in Mindanao for 333 years. That would resist the Dutch and the British. That would exhaust the Americans in 15 years of guerrilla warfare. That would endure Japanese occupation and emerge still fighting. These qualities were not born in 1565 with the Spanish arrival. They were not born in 1896 with the Philippine Revolution. They were there in 1281. when the most powerful military force the world had ever assembled, looked at these islands and found, for once, something it could not conquer. The Mongols built the largest empire in history. They did not build it here. These islands remained free. They always do. Tell me in the comments, did you know this story before today? And which of the 5 reasons for Mongol failure hit you hardest? The geography that made the archipelago unconquerable, or the ancient maritime warrior tradition that had been developing for 50,000 years before the Mongols even existed? If this video changed the way you see Filipino history, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe to Mythos Amit Raj so you never miss a new discovery. Every like, every share, and every new subscriber helps this channel restore the history that was taken from us, one video at a time. In our next video, we go deeper into the pre-colonial Filipino warrior tradition, the weapons, the fighting systems, and the martial arts that made Filipino warriors some of the most feared fighters in all of Southeast Asia. Salamat, see you in the next one.